Okay, welcome everyone and good evening. I'd like to welcome you back for the fourth session now of A Sabbath of the Land for You, Shemitah, Ethics, and Jewish Philosophy with Ms. Sarah Zager and Ms. Ranana Dine. As usual, I would like to encourage everyone joining us here on Zoom to please, if you're comfortable, join us on camera, but do keep yourself muted if you are not meaning to share your audio at a particular juncture, just because sounds happen, noise happens, life happens in the background. If you prefer to use the chat, you are of course welcome to do that here. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can put questions and comments in the comment section below the video, and I'll bring them over here to share with the group and be discussed. And if you're joining us on Drisha Live, hello, we're glad you're here. I'll be sharing a link to the source sheet for folks who would like to follow along independently, but otherwise the sources will be shared on screen. And let's get to it. Ms. Zager, Ms. Stein, take it away.
Okay. Well, welcome to our fourth class. Today we're gonna focus on the topics of like labor and economic justice and the kind of vision of poverty and the end of poverty that that Shemitah presents for us, and how some modern and contemporary thinkers have envisioned the kind of economic ethic that Judaism, particularly maybe Shemitah, but also broadly sketches out. Is there anything else you want to say, Sarah, in terms of introduction before we jump back into Devarim?
I think a reminder from Devarim is a great place to start. So let's just jump right in.
So we don't need to go into great detail because we discussed the contrasts and similarities between Shemitah as presented in Leviticus and as in Deuteronomy in our first session, but we want to bring the text back of from Deuteronomy of what Shemitah looks like, or what kind of Shemitah is envisioned in terms of poverty and slavery in Devarim. I think if we can have someone read either in Hebrew or English quickly, and then we can kind of just sketch out what the vision is here before we delve into our modern thinkers.
I'll volunteer to go. Okay. If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen, any of your settlements, in the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. Beware lest you harbor the base thought. The seventh year, the year of mission, is approaching. So you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you, and he will incur guilt. Give to him readily and have no regrets when you do so. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and all your undertakings. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land. If a fellow Hebrew man or woman assaults you, he shall serve you 6 years, and the seventh year shall set him free. When you set him free, do not let him go empty-handed. Furnish him out of the flock, threshing floor and vat, which the Lord your God has blessed you.
Great, thank you. So again, I think we looked at this source in our first class, but quickly before we delve into some more thinkers, what is the kind of ideal vision of economic life being described here? What does Devarim want Shemitah to look like in terms of issues of economics and poverty?
Well, the reference to Shemitah, this whole passage is not necessarily about Shemitah. It's just a reference to it in the middle.
So we excerpted it from the longer piece of Devarim.
Oh, it was.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, so it's all part of that general discussion of Shemitah.
Yes.
But it's not something to do just in the Shemitah year. This reference of providing is an ongoing thing. It's just telling you in the middle that just because the Shemitah year is approaching doesn't mean you should not want to give because of the Shemitah year. So it isn't a general commandment for all time. It's nothing to do. It's not just Shemitah, and that's the way I'm reading it.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Ranana.
I was gonna let you.
Okay, I think that there is a way in which that's certainly true. I think if you read it, yeah, and we did a disservice by excerpting it in exactly this way. Right, just before this, it says, right, like there will not be any needy at all. And now I'm going to tell you, and that's a description of what Shemitah is going to be. And then there's a description of, okay, but even within that, like, what are you supposed to do when you encounter a poor person? But yeah, I think it's definitely true that like the kind of general advice of opening your hand to the needy is a kind of broadly applicable advice. And at the same time, part of what's going on in this picture in this text is sort of Shemitah is supposed to help you understand what that looks like, what that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting potential conflict or tension is it seems that like almost if you keep Shemitah, there will never be a poor person. And then if there is, here's how you deal with it. But Shemitah is also something that happens once every 7 years. So are we only talking about how you treat poverty in this 1 year? Or is this sort of like, if we have this system in place, there will always and forever not be poverty? And I see that Judy has her hand up.
No, I had a point that I think these are the verses that are also used as a basis for tzedakah and the halachas surrounding tzedakah, so that it is being used in several ways, although here it seems to be focusing on Shemitah. The rabbis did use this to expand on the concept, I think, of, Kol Yisrael that always there will be the poor and you're responsible for them. And I think it's in more than one way. In particular, when Shemitah is coming up, don't, be warned, and then is not a time for you to close your heart. But I think the opening of your hand is a more general kind of commandment.
Yeah, I mean,
It's certainly been
read it that way anyway.
I'd say this is a good opening for us because we're going to be discussing thinkers broadly on issues of poverty and economic rights, not only about Shemitah. So this is good for us in terms of where we're going to be going. I'm also wondering, like, what does this vision of Shemitah seem to require of us? Because I think that's going to be a major question throughout this this class is what do we owe, what do we require to be doing in order to kind of manage this economic expectation, or the people who we encounter who are impoverished?
I think the biggest thing that this is pushing Devarim overall, right, and Shael talks a lot about this, right, is trying to figure out how do you create a just society, how do you reduce poverty and all that. But I think part of what's happening here is, and what's required of us is trust, right? Because what they're saying is, we know that if you lend money in the 6th year, you're going to lose it because we're going to cancel your debt. But you have to trust that somehow God's blessings will overwhelm you with in a way that you won't lose out by helping the poor person.
Right, and that's obviously also going to be
and that's going to be critical in everything else. Like, why should I give money to somebody else? Well, not only is it a good thing to do for whatever reason, you have to help that other person, but what God keeps promising us is, if you create the society where you're helping the downtrodden, you yourself will benefit. You as the prosperous farmer or the rich merchant or whatever. And that's a hard sell, and Deuteronomy is pushing it pretty hard, and this is one of the more dramatic examples. And as I'm sure you'll get into, we backed away from it, and that's why Hillel had to do Prose Bowl and all those things. This is a hard thing. It's a hard sell.
Yes, Judy?
Also, I think that we've totally moved away from the concept of a Shabbat for the land, we are now really looking at an economic situation and society and not so much the land at all.
Yeah, so we don't necessarily owe the land anything in this vision. We only owe the poor person, the laborer, the slave.
Okay.
All right. Any other insights before we jump a couple of millennium?
Well, yeah, there's the obvious. I would close comments to the elephant in the room. It's something that it's hard to deal with. For never cease to be needy ones in your land, which I command you. It's not like there doesn't seem to be this vision that one can eradicate need and poverty, that it will always be there. And at least the text seems to be clear on that.
Right. And that kind of sets us up as an endless requirement, expectation that we're always going to be responsible for how we care for impoverished people, and that there isn't some ideal vision of a utopia where there's a class of society and everybody has exactly what they need. No, rather our requirement is to lift up the people who are in need.
Right, and because you read people, even here in Manitoba, it's make poverty history, eradicate poverty, and obviously we want no one to be poor, and nobody to be hungry, and no one to be needy. But the text seems to be saying here, well, it always will be. So it's a bit of a sobering thought.
I mean, I think as Sarah mentioned, the line actually that we cut out before this is there won't be needy, and then this comes in and I was like, well, actually there will be. So it's a little, there's a tension between the utopia ideal that we want to envision that maybe Shemitah helps us for or something, and reality. Yes.
I want to just throw in one other point here, which is it's unclear from this picture kind of where the scarcity is coming from, right? So there are gonna be needy, and there are also going to be people who have God's blessing. And there's some sense that like one's economic position is tied to God's favor, right? In part, maybe because this is an agricultural society where just sort of meteorological phenomena make a really big difference in people's economic standing. But I think in our world, it might be a little bit, the sources of scarcity might be different. And so, yeah, I think like some of these sort of, contemporary calls to eradicate poverty are, at least sort of, as I read them, a call not to eradicate, a call to eradicate some of the social forces that lead to poverty. But it might be that other kinds of scarcity, especially in the coming climate disaster, God forbid, maybe really just like very much part of our lives. So I don't know. I think there's differences between sort of scarcity of resources and some of these like structural forces that might play a role. But all that said, it's useful to kind of remember not to impose too much of like a contemporary, capitalist market reality onto industrial capitalist market reality, rather, onto a text that doesn't quite live in that world.
I think
I know.
Mute your computer. Okay. Sorry about that. I've always appreciated the sort of like the realism of that. There's never not going to be poor, because it's not saying like sometimes it's sort of like we're striving for some, like I feel like poverty is one of those things where it's like it can look like it's gone. And if we forget that it's not gone, even when we can't see it, we leave people behind. And so like saying there's never not, you work really hard because there's never not going to be poor is sort of like sobering. Yes, but it's also sort of like, not hopeful, but sort of like encouraging. It's like, this is the thing you have to keep, like, you know, we'll keep working on this because it never really goes away. There's always going to be forms of need and things that people are going to, you know, need in different ways. Always be open-handed, always have this attitude to everyone around you, because like, and even if it is gone, like kind of like you were saying, Sarah, there are ways in which people can slip back into it. Like it can come back. So it's not sort of like an absolute thing that like goes away and doesn't come back and whatever, you know?
Yeah, it's certainly going to get you out of the mentality of thinking, oh yes, I've solved the problem now, I'm done, right? Like this text is never going to let you there. I noticed that we have a comment from someone on Facebook Live who asked the following question. The difficulty of observing Shemitah contradicts God's entreaty at the end of Deuteronomy that the Torah is not too hard to follow. Christians also seem to claim that halacha is too hard to follow. Is this not a problem? I mean, maybe it is a problem, but I think perhaps the kind of like within the space of a breath, or, you know, 5 psukim kind of contradiction between there won't be any poor people, oh no, there will be poor people, is I think one way of sort of seeing that the text really recognizes that this is a problem, and recognizes that this isn't going to be an easy problem to fix, and that's okay, even if the Torah is supposed to be something we can figure out how to live out. It might be that even living out what the Torah wants us to live out doesn't actually exhaust the realm of like solving all social problems.
Yeah, I was also gonna say we actually encountered this line last week from Rav Kook of God cannot demand things that are impossible. And that was part of the reasoning behind allowing for the Heter Mechira, for allowing the sale of land to Gentiles to farm the land during Shemitah in modern Israel. So we do have that tension, and we have reasons and ways to think through when that kind of problem arises, and with, I don't know, quote unquote halachic solutions. But I think what Sarah was saying about like this tension and how it exists and what that means also applies. We also had another comment from Facebook, it seems like, about whether the standard of poverty could also be changing, or what does the poor look like at any one time. And I think that is another thing of like, in certain quote unquote prosperous times, it's possible that what poverty looks like has changed, and the standard of living has changed. But there will always be some who are better off and some who are worse off. I also know we have 2 hands up, but also we want to move on to our other sources. So maybe we take these 2 comments quickly and then we'll move on. Well, I see 3 hands up. Harvey, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I would just kind of just highlight it ends up by telling us you should share from what you have because you've been blessed. So we're going to some of us will have plenty, and it's telling us off the bat. He said, "Don't harden your heart." So it's telling us to be caring, be compassionate, to share, because people have. I mean, maybe I'm stating the obvious, but it's telling us just because we're blessed doesn't mean we can close our eyes to everything the society be around us and not act appropriately.
I had a thought that just hit me, that in some way the poor person has some kind of power over the supposedly blessed rich person, because there's a stress, and this is a theme throughout, I think, Chumash, is he will cry out to the Lord against you and you will incur guilt. And do it because you won't have regrets, because God will bless you because of this. So the poor person has some kind of role to play and has some kind of relationship to God vis-a-vis the rich person. I mean, he is as much part of the rich person's blessing as a fruitful piece of land.
Right, and just to sort of pick up on Judy's point and try to answer the question earlier of how can you have these contradictory verses and is this all too hard? I think the point that Devarim is trying to make here and God trying to make it again, it's one of trust, is if we really followed all of the rules of Deuteronomy, there would be no poor people because God would bless us, because this whole, you could say just from an economic perspective, a lot of this would work and would help alleviate poverty. But if you're God, you know that we're never really going to follow all of it. And so there's always going to be poor people and you still got to do your best by them. So I think that's where some of this is coming from.
You guys are all having amazing thoughts and insights. And we've already gotten a good discussion on a text that we showed you a couple of weeks ago. But we're going to move ahead to our modern text and try and make sure we have time to cover everything we want to talk about. And basically what we're going to move into is there are a couple different maybe models for thinking through the requirements of poverty and economic justice that offer different ways through the tensions that we've just been discussing. So Sarah, I'm going to let you take the lead on the next one.
Absolutely. Okay. So the first model we're going to think about is really a kind of halachic one, and it may be coming to us from a source that you wouldn't think of as a halachic source, or a source that you wouldn't think of as talking a lot about halacha, and that's Zager Musar, which is sort of the opening salvo of Rav Yisrael Salanter, who's the founder of the Musar movement. And he is interested, I think, in trying to give a story about what what economic laws of halacha are supposed to do for us. I think you'll notice maybe some resonances with some of the stories we saw last week, especially from Rav Kook, or the last 2 weeks. But he notices out in his community that there are lots of people who are very fastidious about all kinds of kind of bread and butter type halachic matters, literally bread and butter, but also kind of, part of the core of things, but that they're not as fastidious about economic matters. And he thinks this is a serious problem, but he also thinks it's a good example of how his method of kind of reforming your character is supposed to go. So he actually thinks, even though it's very bad that we're in this situation where people don't care very much about these economic issues, nonetheless, it provides an opportunity for thinking about how we might kind of become better people. So I would love for someone to read, unless you're feeling like deeply wedded to Salanter's somewhat strange Hebrew, I recommend the English, but I'm open to either. And if you could read like one chunk at a time and then pause, that would be awesome. Richard, is that your hand? I can't. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
For an illustration, in our district, praise to the Almighty, the injunction to abstain from non-kosher meat is naturally implanted within the souls of Israel. So strong is the proclivity that no one has to force his nature and desire to abstain from non-kosher meat. It is foreign to him. There is no kosher butcher who would not consult a competent halachic authority concerning the status of any questionable meat, even if his inquiry would cause him a significant loss. The fear of Hashem is within him, in his nature and his ways. This generates the attitude, God forbid that I should do evil and deceive my fellow Jews.
Okay, so just to stop here, Ron, can you scroll up just a tiny bit? Okay. One thing I would just want to pull out quickly is that Salanter's whole picture is in some way about two kind of different tasks that he thinks all people have to do. The first is kivush hayetzer. So you have a yetzer hara and you need to conquer it. You need to get it under control. And then the second step is tikkun hayetzer. You need to like rearrange your yetzer so that it's not as bad as it was when it started out. And he says that with respect to kashrut, we've kind of already done tikkun hayetzer because we don't even have these bad desires. We don't need to worry. No one would even if there's a lot of money involved, no one would be in the business of, selling a questionable meat or whatever, even if they're risking a lot of money, because they have already kind of organized their whole sense of self and all of their desires around this. Not so, he says, for other kinds of economic questions. I'll keep going.
It's
unless there are
amazing to think
questions.
about how far we have fallen, because while Jews who keep kosher might be willing to sacrifice money and honestly keep kosher, not always clear that the butchers are so honest about it.
Yes,
We've all
yes.
had our scandals there.
We've all had our scandals there, right? Right.
However,
No, and it's interesting that he thinks like there is there's sort of continuity between kind of Amcha and the butchers, which is not.
well, maybe in his day there really was, and that's a nice thing.
Yeah, I think maybe in his day there was. Also, I think like whatever, industrial kashrut is like a whole different animal that he can't imagine. So there you have it.
Truth in that, yeah.
Okay.
However, in the multitude of our sinful business dealings, we find just the opposite. Most people do not seek advice concerning a suspicion of stealing from their fellow. Oftentimes, they oppress victims even before legal claims are fairly evaluated. Some people, even after legal decisions are made, execute deceptive or strong-arm tactics. Doesn't the Torah view all these things equally? All of them are classified as transgressions according to the Torah and its judgments. Thus, whether concerned the Torah injunctions pertaining to non-kosher meat, like you shall not eat flesh of an animal torn in the field, or you shall not eat any carcass, or you shall not oppress your fellow, and you shall not steal, all these are equally transgressions of the Torah and must be stringently observed.
Sorry. The next chunk is also part of this chunk in the Hebrew. So if you keep
Okay.
going, that would be awesome.
It is naturally ingrained in the soul of Israel that all non-kosher meat is forbidden to him. Whatever meat is declared non-kosher by a halachic authority, he will distance himself from it and conduct himself only according to the Torah, except in the case of swordfish. So too, in money matters, whatever the Torah classifies as belonging to one's fellow, if someone else besides the owner has it, this is stealing, and he transgresses, you shall not steal. We see in the multitude of our transgressions that even the scholars, as well as nearly the God-fearing people, are not careful to refrain from this sin. And yet, so serious is this transgression that Yom Kippur and even death do not grant atonement.
Okay. So he's now said, for kashrut, we've done both parts of the process. We've sort of quashed our Yetzer Hara, and then we've rearranged it so it no longer desires the bad things. But for other kinds of economic matters, we haven't done that. There's no, we haven't rearranged ourselves such that then it wouldn't occur to me to go and ask a shaila about whether I am inadvertently stealing from someone, even though that's the same level of problem as, you know, all of the kinds of questions you worry about with your kitchen. For those of you for whom like asking a shaila is sort of a part of normal life, I would like challenge you to think for yourself how many shailot you've asked in the last, I don't know, 6 months, a year, about kashrut, and how many you've asked about your financial life. I will say I have asked many kashrut shailas and asked 0 financial shailas. That's not a good reflection on me, right? Okay. And is a reflection of this problem. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns before we move on to the last little step. All right, finish it off.
I was just going to say also quickly that I think it's important. I think that there's also a tone here of hypocrisy of like, oh, all you people who think you're so firm and so holy, who are, you know, running to the rabbi every time you have a question about, you know, a spot in your chicken egg, you know, but you aren't doing this, you really aren't so holy, right? He's pointing out a way that his society is being hypocritical.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So now I think in the last little chunk, he's going to give us a story about what we're supposed to do about this problem. And he's already told you that it's really urgent.
Yet, if a man will direct his heart and soul to learn in depth the laws germane to business matters from the Talmud and the halakhic authorities, each person according to his ability, a character transformation will take place. If the focus of his study to internalize the knowledge of the forbidden and the permitted, then his study will be particularly effective to guard him from stealing. Even if at first he is unable to desist from all infringements of stealing, he should not despair, for this is due to the strong desire to steal, as well as the prevalent practices of society. He should know with certainty how great is the power of Musar, that slowly a vast acquisition of knowledge and new habits will take root in his soul. Eventually, questions concerning kashrus and questions concerning stealing will be equally important in his eyes.
Okay, so this is where I think you see like a little bit of a remnant of some of the Rav Kook that we discussed in the past couple of weeks. He thinks that if we sit and learn the halachot associated with these economic prohibitions, we will then eventually come to transform our character in such a way that we don't desire to steal anymore. That's a long process. It's a process that over the course of, the rest of his writing, he's going to lay out all kinds of methodological tools that you can have for doing this that like range from, reading certain texts to like chanting and all kinds of other practices that he suggests. But he really thinks that if we sit down and learn the texts, the halachot themselves as a kind of text will help us rearrange our economic preferences, right? Or at least learn to resist certain kinds of economic temptation. So in a way, that's sort of similar to what we saw with Rav Kook, who also thinks that, we can observe Shemitah just by reading about it, and that will have its effect on our soul. There's a similar kind of story about what we can do by having the kinds of conversations that we've been having for the past several weeks. I'm interested in whether this feels to people like a good, like, does this set of tools feel like plausible to you, or does it feel sort of a little bit far-fetched? Like, does this seem like it would work? Yeah, Judy.
Right.
Well, I'm
I have a
sorry.
question and a comment. What do you mean by set of tools?
Oh, sorry. There are multiple people talking. Set of tools, as in, if you have a problem where you want to, learn the halakha, like where you are finding yourself, drawn in by your desire to take things that aren't yours in whatever way. Like, do you think the solution of like sitting down with Choshen Mishpat is going to actually help you in the way that he describes?
Mm-hmm. I guess my answer would be, I don't know that it would. I don't know whether it would or not, but it hasn't. Like, this is like, I could see a rabbi giving this to our Torah in a synagogue today and it being like applicable to an alarming number of members of their congregation. Like every time like Jews are arrested for like tax fraud or something, it's like, this is what they need to go read, so I guess it's like an alarmingly relevant text in that sense. So maybe, I don't know if it would or wouldn't work. Maybe it hasn't worked. Maybe it hasn't been done is my guess.
Right. Maybe it hasn't worked. Maybe it hasn't been done. Or at least maybe it hasn't been done in the way that Salanter wants, right? There's a way to learn halakha that's like, I have just learned a very interesting intellectual puzzle. And there's a way to learn halakha that's like, okay, I better rethink who I am as a person. And those two are not totally unrelated, but they're also not the same. Okay, Judy and then Harvey.
Yeah, I think it's important that he's using the word musar and the musar movement, because I think that movement recognized that just plain learning wasn't doing it, that there's some kind of ethical edge to this that goes beyond halakha, and that's being discussed in one of the other classes, Drisha classes I'm taking, whether there's ethics beyond halakha, are they separate or not? But the image I have of the Musar movement is that it had to exist precisely because just being from and learning all day long does not make you an honest person.
Yeah,
or an ethical person. Yeah,
right. And there's a way to read. So just like 2 seconds of historical background. This is the opening salvo. So this text is published as a preface to a new edition of Moshe Cordovera's Torah Devorah, for those of you into Kabbalah. And it's his first statement. In some ways, it's his least radical. So like his kind of more, I was once learning this with someone and someone read it and said, well, even a Brisker would say that, for those of you for whom that's like a useful place to pin it. He does think that the kind of learning going on around him is insufficient. But part of what he's doing in this is not only saying halakha alone won't work, but he's also saying actually learning practical halakha for someone who's not sitting and learning all day is a valuable enterprise because it changes their character. Learning the practical halakha can help you not only a sort of intellectual pursuit, it's not only a pursuit that's designed to kind of, teach you the sort of yeshiva curriculum that was developed in Vilna in this period. It's also the Balabatim need to sit and learn what to do with their money. Harvey.
So I'm having a problem with the analogy. So on one hand, he says, Rabbi, someone gets I suppose in his time, someone's got a chicken, chef this chicken, and they're not sure whether there is something wrong with the chicken, or you gave the example of egg and blood, or did I mix this and that, or what do I have to do? So maybe you don't. What he's saying is, you wouldn't want to transgress kashrut, and you want the guy to make sure I'm not passing that line. Yeah, but the other analogy with the stealing, I mean, what are we saying? Is it, if I do this and this, am I okay? If I cheat someone in this manner, is it okay to do it that way? Versus if I do it that way, it's obviously cheating. Can I find a way of cheating without really cheating?
I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So
I mean, cheating is cheating. If you know it's stealing, if Bernie Madoff knows he's cheating everybody, he doesn't have to go to the rabbi and say, well, is this Ponzi scheme really halachically not acceptable? What do you need to go to the rabbi for?
Good. I think it's a great question. I think the answer is this. He doesn't mean, can I enter a Ponzi scheme? Because can I enter a Ponzi scheme is like going to your Rav and saying, can I eat a cheeseburger? Right? That's not the kind of question he has in mind. It's not the kind of fastidiousness he has in mind. He's asking questions like, okay, can I, I don't know, like think of like very small kinds of stealing things, like, you're borrowing, you're like staying in someone's house and you're taking something without asking them, without them giving you permission. Somebody just wrote in Napster. Yeah. You're downloading things illegally from the internet. You are like things that are actually smaller and therefore a little, you think, oh, I could get away with that. And in the same way you look at the bowl and you think, oh, there's just this little tiny bit of something in here that's not supposed to be there. Maybe that's okay. Like, I think there are hard financial lines around theft even, right? If you think about like some of how American just like securities sort of personal investment works, you might have some worries about that, that are not, that don't have to be like kind of really crazy. I also see there's a question from Facebook that's sort of connected to this, which is like, what are the chances the crook is going to want to reform himself? Salanter really thinks that the crook can reform himself, but that it's a really, really hard road. And that the reading the text and the talking to people about the text and all of the other kinds of emotional practices that he thinks are supposed to come along with that actually can lead a very bad person to change their ways, right? So this is the part of the process of like tikkun hayetzer, of reshaping your will that he wants you to pursue. I think I'm gonna pause there.
I just want to say
I'll let Ranana know.
Which is the problem with this is like this might be a beautiful vision for like how an individual can change their character and become a better person, but when it comes to like society, we like need laws that punish people who steal, and we need laws that require people to take care of the poor. Like, they don't have the time to wait for you to like study halacha for years on end and become a better person. Like, that's
so I think
wonderful, but like actually
stories about how the social piece works.
An infrastructure that this does not really provide.
Yeah, and part of it is he doesn't want to think of, like, he lives in Vilna in the or just outside of Vilna in the 1860s. He doesn't think that halacha is going to be the thing that is going to force people to take care of the poor in a kind of coercive power. If you don't do it, you'll get punished with.
On the structural issues, we had a dramatic case of this, a bunch of years ago, right? With literally with kashrut, right, where there were the raids on the illegal aliens who were underpaid and so forth in Rubashkin and whatnot. And I'm sure it's not only there. And the OU and some of the others said, hey, that's the government's problem, that's not our problem, we only care whether the knife was sharp enough. And then, of course, there were some groups that said, no, we really want to certify that, everything's being humanely done. But those have not necessarily taken off and become, the communal standard, however you want to define it. So literally, Salantra's thing is there. As for the rest of us, I think, we, a lot of people, I think, work on sort of the buyer beware concept. If I can get away with something, then, we'll make the sale or whatever. And that's not quite where the halacha wants you to go. And so you can study it and see that you shouldn't do some of those things, but it's not as easy as internalizing the kashrut or some, more easily measurable, every circumstance the same ritual act.
Okay, I'm gonna sort of close the comment period on this amazing text, but I want to encourage people to shoot their thoughts into the chat, and I'll hand things over to Ranana to give us some loviness.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So in the interest of time, I'm going to not read the Mishnah text, but and move straight to Levinas, down here. So Levinas, French Jewish philosopher, second half of the 20th century, very famous for developing a secular philosophy, for the lack of a better word, based in ethics and the idea of encountering the face of the other and being obligated to the other in that encounter. And also he wrote these Talmudic dialogues, which were him sort of reading the Talmud through his philosophy and seeing how the Talmud could kind of explicate some of his philosophical questions. So one of his dialogues was called Judaism and Revolution. It was commenting on a section from Bava Metzia, and it starts with this famous Mishnah from Bava Metzia about hiring laborers, and whether you have what the kind of contract you can have with your laborers. And in this, it has a story. I'm going to read it quickly. It once happened that Rabbi Yochanan ben Mattia said to his son, "Go and hire laborers for us." His son went and struck a deal to provide them with food. So he makes a contract with the workers that will give you such and such food. When he came to his father said to him, "My son, even if you make them a banquet like Solomon's in his time, you will not have fulfilled your obligation to him, for they are the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But rather, before they begin to work, go and say to them, on condition that I am not bound to give you more than bread and beans only." And it ends with saying, actually, you can go by the custom of the place. But the center of this story is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Mattia thinks that these Jewish laborers could ask for anything and everything, and they'd be owed it because of their lineage. And so you actually have to set a more specific contract than saying, we'll give you food. So Levinas is going to come in here. Again, I'm going to read this quickly so we have a chance to discuss and say, what does this mean about what is required for us to give to the laborer in his particular understanding. Here are some indications as to the extent of the other man's right. It is practically an infinite right. Even if I had the treasures of King Solomon at my disposal, I still would not be able to fulfill my obligations. Of course, the Mishnah does qualify this. In question is the other man who descends from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are human beings who are no longer childlike. Before a self-conscious humanity no longer in need of being educated, our duties are limitless. Workers belong to this perfected humanity, despite the inferiority of their conditions and the coarseness of their profession. So there's some traditional Levinasian language in here, which can be hard to unpack. But at least my reading, and I'd be interested to hear what others think, is that Levinas reads the story in the Mishnah and basically says these workers are stand-in for any member of humanity, and when you encounter them and their needs, you can never meet their needs. Their needs are infinite. If you have all the treasures of King Solomon, you could not give them everything they deserve or everything you are obligated to give them. And so we're living in a world where we are always going to be kind of obligated to our workers, to the people who we interact with, and we can never quite really meet their needs. So I'm kind of wondering how people see this lining up with some of what we saw in Devarim, maybe some of what we saw in Salanta. What kind of vision here do we have of like economic justice and labor rights? And I think some of the questions we've been asking about practicality also can apply here.
Well, right. I mean, that we should always in our interactions with people think about them in terms of, you're dealing with somebody of infinite worth, but Tselem Elohim and so forth. At the same time, the rabbis, right, in so many areas were wonderfully practical, and you have to figure out what's a realistic thing to do, even if in the ideal, I should do more, or I should at least have more regard for them, more respect for them. Right, a lot of that's going on in the world today, not only the issues of workers feeling underpaid, but workers feeling under-respected. And so there's, I think, it's an element here of that as well. And it is interesting, and right, which gets back a little bit to the stealing stuff too. What is the local standard for what should pay workers? And that would have been Rubashkin's argument, or the OU's argument was, hey, there are labor laws, so there's some minimum wage, and you can get away with, but there's also the local standard of if every butcher is hiring illegal aliens and underpaying them, how do you can't compete by paying full wage, or whatever. And so yeah, everybody's got to do this, which is not the halachic answer, not necessarily the moral answer, but it's where people end up with, I'm going to be more worried about my kashrut than my business dealing, because my business dealings will at least match the rest of the market or my perception of it.
Yeah, and Levinas is a little bit oblique on these matters, but he does have this kind of concept of when you're interacting with one other person, you are, again, infinitely responsible, infinitely obligated to them. You have to sacrifice for them, whatever. But then there's a third who comes in and in certain ways limits that obligation. And only in that other person coming in can you suddenly have a limitation on what you owe the other. And so I think, I don't exactly remember what he does with that line from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel in this essay, but right, like that's that kind of third coming in. What's the context? What's another person coming in and saying, well, this is how much I get paid, or this is the food I get given. And so actually to have a sort of society where everyone is meeting obligations to some extent is to treat everyone equally, to take account for who the other people are coming in, who are interacting in the society.
Just to jump in with one little note here, just to compare this to Salanter thinks that if you go and look at the sort of particularities of the halacha, that will teach you how to be the kind of person who doesn't want to steal. But that's actually a far cry from I owe this person everything. Because in a way, for Levinas, the business of trying to specify what you owe someone is a kind of lost cause, and maybe even a sort of misunderstanding of how you ought to relate to them. But whereas for Salanter, there's a way to specify it. There's a way to kind of lay it all out and clarify it. But for Levinas, I think, at least in this version of Levinas, there's not I owe the other person everything I have and more. That's all there is.
I say that we have some questions from Facebook, and the first one I was going to answer is actually the second one that came in about what does this say about someone who becomes poor due to sin because they were involved in a Ponzi scheme or whatever. My understanding of what Levinas would say is, well, you were actually responsible somewhat for the fact that they did this sin and became poor. So you are still responsible for them because you live in a society that allowed for them to make those mistakes, to be vulnerable, to get involved in such things. So he doesn't let you off the hook.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and similarly for the other question that came in, which was someone just remarking that this seems to go against what Rabbi Akiva Paskins in another sugya about, if you have somebody or two people walking in the desert and there's only one can of water, you should save yourself first. Yeah, I think Levinas doesn't think you should save yourself first. And I mean, Ranana, if you disagree with me about that, I'm totally happy to defer to your expertise. But I think he doesn't think that, and he, in his darker moments, thinks you actually, you have to sacrifice yourself for the other in some sort of complete way. And he's not the sort of thinker who's going to be bothered by like making sure that everything he says fits with everything that's in the Gemara. That's not the sort of project he's doing. But yeah, he really believes that you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is always this good question of whether what Levinas is saying is actually how we can live, and if in that created situation of there's only water for one, it might be that you're kind of supposed to fail in saving yourself. But yes, I definitely in various places he would think that you are sort of obligated to sacrifice for the other. He just never puts it in these kind of specific like cases. He doesn't think like that. He kind of writes in this sort of general philosophical sense. So actually what you would do when when the actual case emerges, Levinas isn't always so helpful in answering those questions. I think in the interest of time, we only have technically 8 minutes left, and we have a whole nother model to go through. Who knew that this was going to be the one that generated all this conversation? So I do want to make sure that we get to these sort of questions of actually now, what does this mean for broader society?
So I think if we just we're not going to go, we might not go through all the Mishnayot, but I want to just sort of track where we've been so we can see where we're going. So if the first model was a model that was about kind of understanding particular laws for the individual, right? For and using them to kind of shape the individual. The second model seems to be, rather than dividing up this big ethical challenge of how I'm supposed to engage in kind of fair economic relationships with other people into a series of little tasks or little rules that I can figure out how to follow. We explode it to be the biggest thing that can possibly, the biggest thing in the world, right? The biggest thing that is sort of going to be the orienting principle around which we focus our lives is our obligation to the other as an infinite debt. The third model, I think, really focuses a little bit on Prose Bowl, but actually starts to talk about economic justice as a kind of systemic issue, and an issue that requires thinking about how rules function for a whole society. So just to give us like, actually I'll read through the Mishnayot. We're gonna see 2 Mishnayot, and then we're gonna see the way that Rabbi Jill Jacobs kind of reads them and connects them in order to give one of a series of definitions of Tikkun Olam that she's messing with, and sort of using to make her arguments. But I want you to see this particular definition because it is sort of helpful for thinking about one way that we might think about what Shemitah is and what Shemitah is supposed to do for us. Okay, so this is the first Mishnah, and mostly I'm interested in the last line, but I want you to know about the context that comes before. So, a widow is not paid for the property of orphans, except if she takes an oath that she has not already received payment from her ketubah. The courts, however, were reluctant to administer the oath, and so Rabban Gamliel the elder established that she should take any vow that the orphans want, and then collect her ketubah. And witnesses sign a get because of Tikkun Olam, and Hillel established Prose Bowl because of Tikkun Olam. So we met Prose Bowl earlier on, but I want you just to see that in this Mishnah, these 3 things are grouped together. So this business about the woman, the widow or the divorcee taking an oath in order to get her ketubah, 1. 2, witnesses signing a get because of Tikkun Olam, and 3, Prose Bowl. All 3 of those are identifying a place where the kind of legal system goes wrong, doesn't do what it was supposed to do, or gets stuck, quite literally in the case of the oath for the orphans, and instead sort of needs to be fixed. And what it means to fix the world is really to fix the system, right? Okay, so then this is the kind of classic statement about why prose bowl is established, which we may remember from past weeks, right? This is one of the things that Hillel the elder established when he saw that people were reluctant to lend to one another, and that they were violating what is written: beware lest you harbor the base thought that the 7th year is approaching, the year of remission, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord God against you, and you will incur guilt. Therefore, Hillel established the prose bowl. Okay, so again, the reason we have prose bowl is actually because there's a sort of, not only is there a systemic legal break, but that systemic legal break arises because of a sort of psychological problem. So there's a way in which actually this Mishnah is sort of looping back what we were calling model 1 and what we're calling model 3. Those two things get connected. Okay, so here's Rabbi Joel Jacobs, the head of Truah, in her sort of survey of different approaches to Tikkun Olam. Okay, with the invention of prose bowl, Hillel overturns a biblical law. Given that the Torah specifically forbids potential creditors from refusing to make loans in the year preceding Shemitah, we might expect Hillel to respond to the widespread disregard for this prohibition by castigating his community for his sins, i.e., we might expect him to be saying what Rav Salanter says, essentially, right? Instead, Hillel, perhaps recognizing that the entire system of lending and borrowing is at risk, devises a legal loophole that allows for the technical observance of the Shemitah year while also protecting leaders from losing money as a result of this biblical institution. In all of these Mishnaic cases, we might translate mipnei tikkun ha'olam as for the sake of the preservation of the system as a whole. Within the Mishnah, the phrase is invoked in response to situations in which a particular legal detail, or I might say also people's kind of motives, threatens to cause the breakdown of an entire system. So here, I think the picture we get is less of something that we could do, work we could do on ourselves, or of an infinite problem or an infinite debt between two individuals, but instead thinking on the level of a system. And how might we create a system that will actually work for a large number of people and that will take into account some of the kind of human problems we encounter on the ground, even if those problems arise as sort of as the product of people's weakness and people's failure to engage in the very kind of project that Salanter wanted them to engage in through Tikkun HaYetzer, through rearranging their internal desires. So I'm interested in whether, if you sort of read, if we go back to where we started, which of these models or ways of thinking about economic justice or questions of economic justice feels like it's kind of most operative? And since we only have 1 minute, I'll kind of give away the ending, at least for me, which is, I think that there are ways in which we have to use all 3 of them because they might not be as separable as we thought. In fact, right, and we saw that a little bit with Hillel at the end, the kinds of internal work we need to do through engaging with the norms that we try to live our society by, or try to structure our society, actually those norms do work on us, and they do work on the kinds of two-sided relationships we have, but they also do work on the broader system. And actually we can kind of connect all of those different things, and maybe that actually gives us a more robust picture of what an economically just world might look like and how we might live in them. I will leave it there, but people should feel very free to ask questions. I at least can stick around for a minute or two.
Harvey?
So maybe this is getting a little technical, but in terms of how the Prost Law works, basically the debts are given over to the Beit Din. So so that way people would continue to lend money, because if you don't lend the money, the people who need the money are going to have economic difficulties. But then you're not having the intent of beginning the loans, which is what people really need at some point, is have that loan forgiven. So we're doing this to keep the economic system going, but we're not really necessarily looking after the needy, who at some point, some people just need to have their loans forgiven. Nations get their net debts forgiven. But individuals, it's almost like you have to go bankrupt, and maybe that's what bankruptcy do, though. But even then,
yeah, I think so. One thing that's sort of implicit in what Rabbi Jill Jacobs is saying here is, yeah, the system, like, it's only worth doing something mipnei tikkun ha'olam, in the sense of for the sake of the preservation of the system, if the system is really working. So you might come along and say, wait a minute, the system isn't, a system that never remits debts is not working, because we learned, like, sort of very obviously in the Torah, that you have to do this. You need people to have relief from debts. And so, yeah, it's great you're propping up the lending system, but you're kind of kicking the can down the road, because in fact, the real problem is people need remission from debts. People need a way to start over. And you're never going to provide that if you hand your debts over to the Beit Din every 7 years. So yeah, there's a way in which, I mean, I think, sort of just knowing her a little bit and sort of her outlook on things, I think she'd say, well, look, like, yeah, you can act for the sake of preserving the system, but you better be sure that system is really is a just one, right? So you can, and that maybe that's a way of making the system more just, but it also might be a way of propping up a really kind of faulty system, or even like more deeply entrenching its faults.
And I think it's also interesting to think about, like, what happens if you fall too far into debt. In like, my understanding of the like biblical financial system is you end up as a slave, in which time you go free every 7 years. So there might still, in certain ways, this might actually still have that kind of like remission of the ultimate debt, or like some kind of bankruptcy there. And so it's trying to understand what the kind of biblical financial system is, and whether it's a just system might require kind of thinking about how all of it kind of works together as a piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And like, for them, slavery is a kind of viable option for what happens when you can't get the remission you need. But if we're going to come from a posture of like, that is deeply unacceptable, then we start to say, okay, a system with prosbul is a system with no escape valve for anyone. And that's kind of ethically untenable.
These are interest-free loans, so they can still become a burden. You can still end up being enslaved in that system, because over time you can't repay the amounts. But it's not quite as bad as as some of our modern lending challenges with fees and excessive interest rates.
Certainly, like, loans with exorbitant interests are a lot harder to get out of than
student loans, for example.
Yes. Precisely.
They weren't paying to send their kids to the colleges where people like Sarah and I could meet.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very much. Next, go ahead.
No, I was just saying thank you.
Next week we will be talking a lot about freedom and Yovel. And I'm really excited to finish off our conversation.
Okay, I would like to thank both of our teachers, Ms. Zager and Ms. Dine. This was wonderful. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for your very active and wonderful participation in our learning community here at Drisha. We look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. If you want to join another class between today and next class, you're more than welcome to look at our other offerings on our website. We do have a class running tomorrow that I think is really, really super. And if you are thinking about maybe being in the New York area towards the end of the calendar year, we are still planning to have our Winter's Mon in person, and we are still taking applications, and we would really, really love to see anyone who wants to come and bring their questions and other wonderful thoughts. Everyone be well. Thank you.